Good afternoon from East Africa, everyone. My name is Mercy Ngunjiri. The project implementation specialist at IFDC based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'll be the moderator for the webinar. So it's an honor to have you all join us, and I would like to welcome you all to the KeFERT virtual global webinar on digital soil mapping on the Kenya Soil Fertility Status Map portal. And just to give you a little bit of background, today's webinar comes after the preliminary webinar held on August the 4th. And this first webinar clearly showed that a mapping portal can have a great impact in improving agricultural productivity and guiding policies in Kenya. The webinar also created great interest from different stakeholders and showed the need for a collaborative effort in expanding the scope of the soil mapping portal. So today's webinar will cover 11 additional counties in Kenya that were not presented in the preliminary webinar to give a total of 21 counties with high productivity potential compared to the 10 counties in the previous webinar. The maps will be presented on a more improved portal with faster processing speed and improved visualization tools. So in this webinar, we have a global audience involved in various agricultural research and development areas in the world. And we believe that having such a dynamic audience is going to attract more perspectives and more insights for application and impact. So in the background, we also have Mr. James Thigpen, who is the acting head of communications at IFDC, and he's based at the headquarters in Alabama, United States. And he's going to offer us with technical support and ensure connectivity throughout the webinar. James, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you, Mercy. Yes, my name is James Thigpen. As Mercy said, and I'm pleased to be here today to offer any assistance. I am located at the headquarters of IFDC in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and please feel free to email me at jthigpen@ifdc.org. You should have received an email from me if you were logged in for your registration. So feel free to reach out with any questions or comments you may have about the webinar, and we can pass them on to the team. And as a reminder, you will receive a recording of this webinar automatically in your email tomorrow. So if you missed a spot, or if you do not have any, have some connectivity issues, or even just want to review the presentations, the video will be made available at that time. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, James. So the program for the day will begin with a briefing and opening remarks from the Principal Secretary of State Department for Crop Development and Agricultural Research in Kenya, Professor Hamadi Boga. We will then have a short overview on the SMART concept by Dr. John Went of IFDC. The main presentation on the mapping portal will be done by Mr. Jeremy Collingly of CropNuts, that is the Crop Nutrition Laboratory Services. Lastly, we are going to have Dr. David Kamau from the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization, who will give some key webinar highlights and closing remarks. So before the closing remarks, we'll have a Q&A session, which will address various questions, comments, and feedback after all the presentations have been presented. And for this, we would like to kindly request the participants to use the question box on the interface to ask questions, send in any comments or any feedback during the presentation. The chat box can be used to send messages to specific participants or to the group, especially for any technical support needed like sound or connection issues. Again, I would like to kindly insist for us to use the question box and not the chat box to send in any questions or comments and feedback. And remember that these will be addressed in the Q&A and not during the presentations. So now it's my honor to invite the PS, Professor Hamadi Boga, to deliver his opening remarks. Again, Professor Hamadi Boga is the Principal Secretary of State Department for Crop and Agricultural Research in the government of Kenya, and we are honored to have him here with us. Professor Boga will give us an overview on the implications of soil mapping and therefore a mapping portal and how this fits into the Kenyan national strategy. So welcome, Professor Boga. I hope he's here with us already. Thank you. Professor Boga, maybe if Professor Boga has not joined us yet, we can have our next presenter, who is Dr. John Went from the IFDC, to give us a presentation on the SMART concept, which is an approach from soil analysis to smallholder fertilizer use. Dr. Went is the Deputy Director of Field Research at IFDC. Welcome, Dr. Went.
Thank you very much, Mercy. So I'm going to give a very brief presentation on the SMART approach to delivering balanced fertilizers to smallholder farmers. So, let me first just talk about why balanced fertilizers are important. You can see on the left side of the screen the nutrients removed every time you harvest 5 metric tons of maize. That is in the grain and stover. So some of those nutrients will be returned if the stover is returned to the field. Often it's not. It's used for livestock feed. So most fertilizers only are supplying the N, P, and K. Sometimes just NP if the soil has sufficient potassium. But there's other nutrients involved as well that are needed for optimal crop growth. Small amounts of secondary and micronutrients can greatly improve yields, particularly when they're severely limiting. These are the secondary nutrients: calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then there's a slew of micronutrients, including zinc, boron, manganese, iron, and copper. And when these nutrients are not present, they can limit yields. So they need to be in the fertilizers, and we need to know if they're deficient and where they're deficient. So our challenge is to bring better fertilizers to smallholder farmers, most of whom cannot afford or access analytical services, are purchasing in small volume, maybe just a few bags of fertilizer, and are growing a variety of crops under various soil conditions. And of course, each crop has its particular demand. So it's a unique challenge we have. Compared to commercial farmers, they will get a soil or plant analysis and/or they will get a professional recommendation, and then they can even have a custom fertilizer blended depending on the size of their farm. Smallholders cannot do this. They cannot afford soil analysis oftentimes, and crop-specific recommendations may not be available at their level, and they will only be buying a few bags of fertilizers, which cannot be produced economically. It's very difficult to produce just 3 bags of fertilizer, for example, virtually impossible. So the approach we take, we describe as the SMART approach, which begins with a full analysis of the soil throughout the region of interest. And the region of interest in this case is the highly agriculturally productive potential counties in Kenya. These are mapped. We're mapping the nutrient availability, both deficiencies, sufficiencies, soil acidity constraints. Then these are validated. I would say the recommendations development step involves validating the fertilizers versus current fertilizers that are already available to farmers in terms of yield and financial returns. And these fertilizers are then transferred to farmers. So that's scaling up production and distribution. And these last two steps need to occur in a conducive policy environment. For example, if regulations are very stringent, it may take, in some cases, years for a new formulation to be approved. And this can really slow down the innovation that the fertilizer industry can bring to the market. Just going over these steps quickly, we do want a full and accurate soil analysis in the region of interest. And then this is because we need to capture all potentially deficient nutrients. The samples must be georeferenced in order to map them. The mapping step, we take those analysis and we map them, which will be described later. And it shows the geographic distribution of the deficiencies. And this helps fertilizer companies and lime producers understand where they need to target their fertilizers. It also guides fertilizer suppliers on where to target their products, and it has an influence on policy. For example, the policy might have some component of best products to subsidize, or it may influence policy by facilitating the development and use of more balanced fertilizers. Here are just some examples from Rwanda. And in this these graphs, sorry, this is Rwanda and Burundi combined. These were mapped in previous IFDC projects. And so just a very rough look at this. I don't want to overcomplicate it for you, but the red is basically the most constrained, going up to a blue color where there is no constraint and perhaps excess. So basically anything in the red, orange, or yellow are considered by standard criteria to be deficient. And so you can see there's multiple deficiencies, and the range of these deficiencies, the geographical extent, really helps for fertilizer and lime producers to understand what they need to produce and where their market is going to be. In the recommendations development step, we do consider that soil analysis only indicates likely deficiencies. Interpretation of soil analysis can be complicated, as we are finding out. It is not a prescription. And I put up a map of zinc on the right side because you can see a lot of that area is in green, but in fact we find those green areas being responsive to zinc. So validation, it actually provides the economic proof that the formulations are better when they're field tested. Our goal is not perfection for every farmer in that region. Our goal is a better fertilizer than what farmers are already using. And this recommendation development step is best done in partnership with fertilizer producers who will ultimately be providing the products. And so here are just some examples of balanced fertilizers that have been produced. The top one up there is from Zambia. The one below it is from Ethiopia. This is a rice plot from Rwanda. And this is climbing beans also from Rwanda. So the results of balanced nutrition, balanced crop nutrition can be quite dramatic. And then the final step is transfer to the farmers. So this requires farmer sensitizations through demonstrations and small fertilizer and lime packaging, extension support, and it needs to be facilitated through a fair subsidy environment if subsidies exist. That means that, for example, if there's been a habit of subsidizing only NPK fertilizers, then that needs to be expanded to allow other fertilizers to receive subsidies. So getting to the policy and regulations, in Kenya, we do have a very vibrant private sector and quality blending industry. We have good regulations that facilitate rapid product entry. And of course, we prefer, well, I would say that when subsidized blanket fertilizers, blanket NPKs, smallholders will purchase those due to cost. So there needs to be either a fair subsidy environment or elimination of subsidies to facilitate widespread use of better fertilizers. And that's some of the policy implications that need to be addressed in many countries. This is a final slide from Mozambique showing the effects. I would like to thank you for attention, and I hand it back over to Mercy.
Okay, so we can have our next presenter, Mr. Jeremy Cordingley. As I introduced him, Jeremy, you can please proceed. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jeremy Cordingley, Managing Director of Crop Nuts, Crop Nutrition Services, and I'm here today to talk about the Kenya Soil Mapping Project presentation, which we've done in partnership with IFDC. So Crop Nuts, Crop Nutrition Services, we're a 22-year-old business focused on laboratory testing, mainly soil testing. We have agronomy support officers in the field helping farmers to practice good agricultural practices. And we have an agricultural technology team helping us to scale laboratory and agronomic knowledge to farmers across Africa. So for those of you who don't know us, in the laboratory, we work mainly here in Kenya, offering accredited soil testing to clients across Africa. We have a soil mapping division, precision farming, and we also have recently introduced mobile soil testing labs for smallholder farmers to combat the issues that John was talking about earlier, giving smallholder farmers for the first time access to soil testing services. And we also do a lot of validation and agronomy trials to make sure that the work and the recommendations that we give to farmers are always proven in the field. This is a good high-level slide on how to feed Africa. I think we're all aware of the declining yield challenge that we have in Africa and the impact of that on food security. Much of this is related to the fact that we have a rapid depletion of nutrients in Africa, as you can see in the bottom left. Those countries in red are depleting nutrients faster than others, and this is resulting in shortages of fertility and soil health, which in turn is creating this yield gap. So this yield gap, as you can see, Africa on the right-hand side, we've still got a yield gap of 70 to 80% in many conditions. And much of this yield gap is attributed to declining or low soil fertility, up to 45%, according to research. So it follows that in order to close the yield gap, reverse nutrient decline, that we need quality soil information. This slide is, for me, one of the more important slides for getting the message of balanced nutrition across to a wide audience. It has indicates what we call the law of minimum. And basically what it means that in the bottom left, scenario 1, this is an example, is that the yield, as designated by the size of the plant, is always going to be limited by the most limiting factor in the soil, or agronomy per se. So in this condition 1, you can see that it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you put, as indicated by N, the yield will always remain low until we address the most limiting factor, which is, in this case, example, phosphorus. As we address phosphorus in scenario 2, the yield comes up, and the yield could now be limited by potassium. So in the case of example 1, where a farmer maybe applies extra nitrogen, they're actually using perhaps a loan or finance to buy an input that will not actually lead to a yield increase. So having this soil information and then applying a balanced nutritional program will move the farmer through scenario 3 to 4, where we're adding sulfur and micronutrients, up to 5, and that is the approach to lifting yields in Africa. And we have to know and understand the soils. And one thing that parameter here that is not shown, which is critical as well, is soil acidity, because soil acidity can often be the most limiting factor of all. So why soil mapping? And I know John has very well touched on it with the smart mapping approach of IFDC. But traditionally, fertilizer recommendations have often been done through a blanket approach, which means that they're suboptimal. All soils within an area are treated the same. Once we adopt soil mapping, we start to get maps of soil variations, and you can see the map of Africa on the right there with a tremendous variation in soil types, and that's more complicated by climate, by rainfall, by land use, by historical farming practices. So all those conditions together lead to a huge variation, even within small areas. So soil mapping gives us a regional level of soil fertility status. It helps us to understand soil pH, macro and micronutrients, organic matter status. It gives us an indication of which are the nutrients that are likely to be deficient, and it helps us to inform policy and around fertilizer blending. The project scope, so we were contracted by IFDC to develop soil fertility status maps for 21 high productivity counties in Kenya, using both pre-existing publicly funded soil data, which was previous projects that we've done, together with new sample data where gaps existed. So this meant that we couldn't do all the counties, but we tried to focus on doing 21 counties in a very detailed way, given the available budget. So you can see the list of 21 counties there from central Kenya, from the Rift Valley, and from Western. And thanks to ACDI VOCA, TechnoServe, One Acre Fund, and OCP for contributing to the success and the data behind the project. So you can see the map on the right there indicating the sample locations, and that will be more obvious in some future slides. So again, for a wide audience, soil mapping, how we do it, it's basically a 4-step process. We pre-select the sample locations using specific statistical processes, which will be explained by Thomas, our head of data science, in a few minutes' time. We then do the soil testing, the wet chemistry in our laboratory, to give highly accurate results for each location. We then carry out the geospatial analysis, which will be again described in more detail, and then we present the maps for all to see. So I'll go now into the portal and just show everybody listening how it works. Give me a second. So are we good? Yeah. So here is the web portal that we've built, and for those that are not so familiar with Kenya, we have Lake Victoria here on the left. We have up here, we have the North Rift and Western. Here we have the South Rift, and then across here, Mount Kenya. And you'll see some areas which haven't been mapped, for example, are national parks or mountains. And clearly the objective over time is to fill in the counties that haven't been mapped as we move forwards. So in the purpose, for the interest of time, I'm not going to take us through every single map because there's a good number of maps, more than 400 maps sitting on this portal. But what I want to do is just to take you through perhaps some interesting findings and just give the listeners and viewers some experience of how to use the portal. So as I said, this is a publicly available portal, and we can give you the web address of that. So in terms of the functionality, I'll start here in the top left. We have a drop down here of all the different parameters that we've measured. So all the macronutrients, micronutrients, organic matter, nitrogen, pH. Then we have the list of the 21 counties. That helps us to zoom into that specific county. We have two types of maps. We have an interpolation map, which is basically a standard type of kriging map to extrapolate soil information across an area. And we also have a probability map. And a probability map gives us an indication of the likelihood of a specific condition existing. Here you can see the legends, and as we change the legend at the top, this legend changes. And the legend is color-coded to indicate in red and orange where we have a low or a problem with that particular parameter. Yellow or green is generally moving to a level where less problems are likely, and the blue colors generally relate to a high condition. So you can see here the 21 counties that we've mapped. On the right-hand side here, we have a few extra layers where we can bring in the sample points. We can also show the sub-county names and the sub-county boundaries. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I can zoom into Eldoret in the North Rift. We're looking at pH here, and we can see that the pH in the North Rift here is sitting around 4.8 to 5.2. But when we actually do a split screen, we can actually start to look at something interesting, which is now let me just remove the sample points for now, which is actually now the probability map of pH. And so we're now looking at the same area. So one is, let me just zoom in here. You can see this is now the same county. Okay, so we're looking at the parameter as pH. This is an interpolation map showing the interpolated values for pH. As you can see, there is low pH in this area. But this now on the split screen on the right is a probability map. And this probability map is showing the probability of pH in water being less than 5. So you can see this probability map really showing up these concentrated areas of soil acidity in the eastern part of of this county. And as you zoom in and you can put the sample points on there, you can actually start to see that some of these points here are sitting at this very low pH. So that's the how you use the split screen on the portal. And what I'll do now is I will go out of the split screen and I will journey down here to Siaya. Siaya is a county that we looked at last time, but it's very interesting because as a county, it has entirely different soil types and therefore has entirely different soil management and fertilizer management strategies. So you can see that as Siaya County in the north, that we've got low pH, so acidity problems. And even as we go and look at potassium, for example, you can see again that Siaya County towards the north has low potassium levels. And as we approach the lake, the potassium levels become much higher. So these are the types of, this is the type of information that becomes very useful to use at a county level when helping to decide on policies around soil management and fertilizer use. So I'll zoom out again. We're still on potassium, so you can start to see that generally the comment around potassium in Kenya is that potassium has Kenya has adequate potassium, and that is true in many areas, many soils. But we should always remember that this is not taking into account very local variations. So we must always use these maps in the correct way. But from potassium deficiencies, you can see that Western Kenya obviously has the bulk of the issues related to potassium, with the blue areas generally indicating higher levels of potassium, but with some areas in central even showing potassium being on the lower side. So next I will go to Embu. So I'll go to the menu over here, Embu. It'll take me to Embu County, and I think again interesting in Embu is that we have in one county we have very different challenges. Up towards Mount Kenya, this is the boundary of Mount Kenya. You can see because of the high rainfall that we have a significant acidity challenge, so low pH. So obviously liming interventions in this area are going to be highly impactful. Providing fertilizer to farmers who have pHs of below 5 in the absence of liming is going to lead to very low efficiencies in use of these fertilizers. So the combination of fertilizer use with lime in these higher rainfall acidic areas is so important. Other nutrients of interest in Embu would be, for example, copper. It's not well known that copper is a problem, and you can see here the red and yellow areas showing low levels of copper in this county, and again here with highlights certain examples. So this map, as I say, is public, and once you start to zoom out and you can see nutrients such as copper, and you can see the red area here at the bottom. I think it's quite well known that Kenya's Rift Valley has very low in copper, and these maps are certainly showing that in abundance. The other nice feature of the maps is around the points. So actually, when you click onto a point, you can get a soil test result format showing the different colors at that specific location. which just helps you to put that particular point into context. So I will move on, but as I said, that the portal will be public as of when we finish today. So I look forward to you enjoying that, and I'll move back to the presentation where I will hand over the control to Thomas, who is our head of data science and worked with our data science team to develop these maps.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to explain a bit more in details on the scientific basic behind the maps. And there are two main things I would like to give insights into, namely the sampling design and the geospatial approach used. As most of you know, the sampling design is crucial for a mapping exercise to stay within interpolation and not go to extrapolation, which may lead to non-reliable results. So in this mapping exercise, the sampling design was especially important. Why was that? Mainly for three reasons. Because the 21 counties which form the area of interest, they are a bit scattered, and there are gaps in between formed by national parks. In addition, as Jeremy already mentioned, we were able to use prior samples to add to this mapping exercise. So we needed to find a balanced sampling scheme to, in the end, get good interpolated values out. So how do we especially deal with the prior samples? We created a data layer we called market value. What does that mean? In the end, in areas where you can see, for example, in top where the black dots are, those are prior or existing samples. And those areas got a lower market value because we did not need to take more samples in those areas. And this market value was based on sample density. So it's a sliding scale. So after defining the area of interest, which algorithm to select sample locations did we use? We used the condition Latin hypercube sampling, CLHS, on a number of geodata layers. As Jeremy pointed out, within the budget, we were able to select 1,300 additional new sample locations. So which data layers did we use? We used soil data layers, satellite data from AFSIS, as well digital elevation model, climatic data, long-term climatic data. And in addition, we used a weighing component called ease of reach. Within this ease of reach, different data layers like the above explained market value, distance to roads, an indicator of hilliness, and the land use based ease of access. So what is the purpose of this ease of reach? As you can imagine, there might be many locations within Kenya which share actually very similar geodata layer compositions, but they may be very different, easily to be accessible, meaning the ease of reach component added some weighing for the selection of sites to make it more easy to reach them. So being closer to roads or having a higher market value, things like that. But in the end, it's not changing the distribution of data layer properties. So it's just to make it more easy, more efficient to reach those sample locations. Okay, so after the sampling design phase was done, the map, as you can see it on the right-hand side, was produced. Then the field teams went out for sampling using a strict protocol and equipped with different toolkits and mobile devices with GPS and so forth. The samples were then analyzed in the CropNet's ISO certified wetcam lab. And having the wetcam data together with the GPS data, we're moving to the next step. Maybe Jeremy, you can go to the next slide. Okay, thanks. So the other part is what you're probably very interested in on the geostatistical approach. So to start with, we produced per county and per soil property separate maps. So they are close to even 600 maps if you count all together. Why did we do that? Because we saw that when you, as you see the sample distribution, especially due to the prior samples, that can lead to clustered, to slightly unbalanced sample locations. And then it's difficult to make sure that you are interpolating, not extrapolating. That was the reason for us to do it per county. To avoid or to deal with county border effects, we actually added some buffer zone around the counties, so points around from neighboring counties were added, so you don't see any border effects on the finally stitched map. So as already defined, which area did we map? So it's a combination of two factors. One is the area of interest, so meaning the 21 counties, excluding national parks. But in addition, to be sure on that we are doing interpolation and not extrapolation, we added some component based on sample density. So within a semi-automated data framework written in the software R, what you see here on the top left figure. So based on the density distribution, the expert user decided on a threshold value, and that's the intersection of an area of interest and density was actually the finally derived mapped area. So as Jeremy pointed out and has shown, there were two types of maps, interpolation and probability. Both were calculated using ordinary kriging with a spatial support of 500 meters. If you look into the workflow of the semi-automated data tool, so after the area of interest, what you see top left was determined, the next step on the top right is the semi-variogram fitting and selection. So even though our packages are out which do that automatically, we still included a visual check if that semi-variogram fitting led to meaningful results or not. The next step, third step, you see down right here is validation. So what did we do? We selected on the fly 10% of the samples within a county based on using Kennard-Stone algorithm, using the GPS coordinates and the soil property value. So to ensure to cover the full soil property space. And then did interpolation without using those validation samples. So it's hold out set. And then the interpolated values were plotted against the wetcam values. We were discussing internally, should we define a threshold to decide which map should be produced or not produced. In the end, we decided to log and monitor the performance per county and soil property, but not to exclude a map to be produced. One important reason was that there are very different spatial supports for the two domains, the interpolation step and the wetcam step. You have to imagine that the wetcam sample is a point sample covering a very small area, while the interpolated value covers an area of 25 hectares. And you can imagine that within 25 hectares, especially in the smallholder context, the expected soil variation can be quite huge. So this type of validation is not really fitting the purpose, at least not within this project in budget. And I'm happy to discuss later in the Q&A on what could be then appropriate validation procedures. Anyway, we have attempted it and logged the performance. And then finally, down left, you see the interpolation output, which is then approved by the user. So in the end, we're trying to mix, or we try to mix the expert knowledge with some automated procedures to deliver high quality validated output. Okay, thanks so far. And I would like to hand over back to Jeremy.
Thanks, Thomas, for that detailed overview, and that we included this time. We didn't have that in August in the webinar because there were obviously a lot of questions about the sampling protocols, and we're really happy to discuss more around that with any of the stakeholders, as Thomas said. So we thought it was important to list our recommendations on how to use these maps. So our recommendation is to use these maps for understanding variations in soil acidity and nutrient deficiencies across the counties, to help identify sites for lime and fertilizer response validation trials within each county, to support lime subsidy programs, e.g. county level lime subsidy programs integrated with farm level soil testing to provide the actual lime rates, and also to support fertilizer subsidy programs to bring nutrient balanced fertilizers to smallholder farmers, so that we move towards only subsidizing soil and yield improving inputs. And clearly, understanding soil quality will help in assessing agricultural production risks and development intervention programs. We also have a list of our advice on how not to use these maps, or the don'ts, let's say. These maps we don't believe and recommend should be used for making generic national fertilizer recommendations without validation trials, which are needed in each county and soil management zone. Also, not to use these maps for making farm-specific fertilizer recommendations. These maps are not a substitute for soil testing and don't allow for local variation in soils and management practices at the field level. Making lime recommendations to farmers, rate and type of lime is based on soil pH levels, texture, calcium, magnesium ratios, and will again vary from field to field. And we don't recommend this is used as a tool for selling fertilizers to farmers. So just quickly on the validation, and John mentioned it, but obviously the validation is the proof, if you like, of recommendations that work. So going through that smart approach, using soil testing, backing the soil testing up with validation trials. So we have validation trials as a group across different locations in Kenya, and this helps us to take this type of soil data and recommendations and do trials on different crops for different yield targets in different agroecologies, where we test different blends, fertilizers, and filling the nutrients and human health gap. This is an example of a fertilizer blend validation trial in the Rift Valley, where you can see on the left the graphs. The left is NPS and already achieving a fairly high rate there with good agronomic practices of just over 50 tons. But as you move to the right and added in NPK, S, calcium, magnesium, so the full portfolio of nutrients into this site, moving the yield up from 52 up to 60 tons with balanced nutrition. So these are really the types of validation trials that are so key to optimizing efficiency and returns for farmers as they use more inputs. So the way forward for Kenya Soil Mapping Portal. So our role in this project was to customize our own mapping portal to enhance the visibility of Kenyan soils. And that as a project has now been completed. But obviously in the future, we'd like to see how, well, with IFTC, how we can move towards developing frameworks of how to use these soil maps within the KeFERT and Ministry of Ag, those stakeholders. Developing a partnership framework for updating and expanding the maps. So how do we map out some of the other counties and look for stakeholders who are keen to contribute in that regard. Obviously exploring added value synergies with other soil mapping platforms. There are obviously a lot of recent developments in soil mapping applications for African soils, and clearly all these have a role and are developed in slightly different ways. So seeing how these can work together to enhance performance of soil data. And incorporation of maps, soil maps into the revised national soil management policy. So that would be something that we'd discuss with PS Borga, and how we can use these maps to really keep an eye on our soils moving forward, and making sure that they're in the good hands for the generations to come. So thanks very much for your attention, and I will hand back now to James.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that presentation, and I hope that it was beneficial for everyone. We'll now have time for some question and answer. We thank you. We've received many questions. I believe some of them may have been answered in these presentations, but Mercy Ngiri will be moderating this question and answer time. And I will ask that the panelists would turn on their microphones and videos for this session.
So I probably will start with the questions to the CNLS, the CropNut. And this, I think, goes to Thomas and Jeremy on the mapping model that was used. We understand it was a geostatistical approach that was used, and the questions that arose from that was on the accuracy level for the approach used, what type of kriging was used, and I've heard you mention some of the covariates that you use, like the soil data layers, the satellite imagery, climate, the digital elevation model. But some people are asking, what other covariates do you use when you're doing the mapping? So pretty much on the model, maybe just give a little bit of a brief summary on that.
Okay, thanks a lot for the good questions. To avoid some confusion, so the covariates were used for deciding on the sampling locations, while for the interpolation, so the kriging was ordinary kriging without additional covariates. Yeah, that's within the timeline and budget given was the way how to achieve. We tried to be stronger on the part of trying to do interpolation and not extrapolation. So we did put more effort on this part. Then let me scroll through the questions. There was one question on, let's see, so the accuracy on the upper limit on the georeference, that was 6 meters. Then
Thomas, there's also a question about comparison with other mapping applications. So I think this is one of the questions that we predicted around the comparison with some of the other mapping applications, such as the new ISDA maps, and what our findings were there.
Yeah. So recently we did 2 test runs. So as I've explained, we did in every county for every soil property a holdout set of 10%. So for those samples, we did comparison to the ISTA soil, because the soil grids was not available at that point in time, some server issues, I guess. So, and we compared the interpolated versus wetcam, and in the, let's say, I try to generalize a bit, or I start differently. I mean, you have to understand there are differences in the maps and of the purpose for what they are used. So, for example, ISTA is a high resolution product, I think of 30 by 30 meters, and it's a global product. And the map we produced is it's a regional or country level product with a much resolution of 500 meters. And when it comes, as I explained before, we have the wetcam data as point samples, which are just maybe less than a square meter or few square meters compared to several hectares within the Kenyan map. So to really make a very good and matching comparison, I think that needs some more thoughts. But what we have seen so far in the comparison we could make was that in principle, all approaches, they tended to predict the mean value. I mean, that's a known phenomenon, that very low values are a bit over predicted and very high values are under predicted. And you can describe that prediction to the mean by the slope of a linear regression. And that might be one criterion to compare maps. And actually, for generally for the soil properties, the Kenyan map had a slightly better slope compared to the ISTA soil. Yeah, but having in mind it's a very different product. It's global, and of course, on the one hand side, there are more advanced algorithms used and more data layers, but it has to be more automated, and less expert knowledge can be on the fly influence the output. So we try to focus more on inputting more expert knowledge during map creation, and that compensated for the methods used. That would be my personal interpretation of the results. Were some new questions coming up in the between?
Yeah, maybe Thomas, as you are on those on answering the questions related to the model and the mapping portal. We have a couple of questions being asked on how the mapping effort that CNLS is carrying out compares with property estimates from AFSIS, ISRIC, and now the most current one, ISDA. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, that's what I tried to refer to before. So we could compare to ISTA. To ISRIC soil grids was not possible, couldn't access the server at that point in time. But I don't expect there are major differences in that sense. I mean, they're using similar, at least from the soil point data, but in different other data layers.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Also,
unanswered questions.
Jeremy, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the overarching themes of the mapping work that we've done with IFDC in the last 8 years has been around the ability to produce soil maps quickly at a very affordable sort of rate. So this gives rapid soil information to countries. So for example, the budget on this was $100,000. Which we would have done in 3 months without the intervention of COVID. So also, as Thomas said, it's the purpose of the maps that really needs to be understood, and also the amount of time and resource that's been attended to them. So I think by combining resources and mapping platforms, we can make the outputs better for all parties and all platforms. So that's, I think, an important point to mention.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry about that. This question goes to John Wendt of IFTC. Have you seen any crop response to boron in Rwanda and Burundi from your previous work?
Yes, we have. In both countries, boron is a nutrient that we see almost universal response in all the crops we've worked with, which is potatoes, rice, maize, wheat, beans and soybeans. I might have left one out there. But yeah, virtually every crop, maybe not cassava so much. And I think that question probably came up, if I may just switch over to my visual here. James, can you give me access to the screen? James?
You should have access now.
Okay. Maybe I'm just not figuring out how to pull it up. Can you see my screen? There we go. Okay. Yes, this particular slide, which shows some of the parameters where we did find a lot of deficiency, and you can see that for boron, we're almost completely red. But as well, sulfur and zinc responses were also almost universal in Rwanda and Burundi. And so I just make that point because it's important in the context of limiting nutrients that all nutrient deficiencies be addressed simultaneously. So, you know, we're seeing yield increases of between 25 and 50%, depending on crop and region in Rwanda and Burundi when we get the balance formulation correct. But boron definitely, along with sulfur and zinc, we've definitely verified as being deficient through omission trials.
Okay, thank you, John. Because of time, we'll have two more questions, which I'll try and synthesize together, and this goes to CNLS. The first one is on data availability. Are you going to be able to avail the point data to everyone? And again, are the maps downloadable? And when is the public going to be able to access the link to the map portal?
Yeah, the maps portal link will be available after this meeting, so immediately. The maps themselves won't be available for download, that we put them into the portal for users to be able to use. And as refers to the data policy, we're still developing the framework around that. So once we've agreed on that with IFTC, then we can send a message to the participants on the way forward.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. So two more questions that I'm going to synthesize together too on potassium deficiency. We had a question on if you based your K-map only on the soil analysis or you did a crop response. And then we have another question on whether you can show maps for Kenya for the non-NPK nutrients, particularly those where deficiencies are indicated. Okay.
So maybe to start with the second question. In total, there are, I think, 14 soil properties mapped in the portal. So they are clearly as well non-NPK nutrients. So everybody can then access portal and view their details. On the first question on the potassium, I mean, the potassium is a bit more complicated in the sense that it a lot depends not only on the actual soil property value, but as well on the soil texture to define if if potassium becomes a limiting nutrient. So it's not captured in the soil property interpolation map, but it's indirectly taken care of in the probability map. Yeah, that is a short answer. But it's a more complicated measure. You would have to mix different data layers to give there a real good advice. But advice sounds like field level, and that's not the purpose of this map.
Also, Thomas, to add, I mean, obviously, you know, these maps are to show indicative levels of different nutrients, and different crops have very different needs of nutrients. So the response to potatoes to potassium is going to be very different to the response of maize to potassium in the same level of potassium soil. So yeah, as we said in the presentation, these maps have to be used in the right way, and they need to be validated. Crops need to be validated in the different counties to get the right appropriate fertilizer recommendation for each area. So that would be an important thing to remember when using the maps.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. One more question that I see popping up a lot here is on the ALSAs, the ALSAs, the arid and semi-arid lands in Kenya, which cover about 88% of Kenyan land. And some people are asking, can the mapping be extended to this area, bearing in mind that we might have to need them in the future regarding especially in climate change? And besides using macro and micronutrients and pH, how important is moisture in mapping as a covariate?
Thomas, I can answer the first part. Yes, I mean, absolutely, we can map the other counties. So, you know, if there are any stakeholders who are willing to step forward and help us to do that, we would be delighted to undertake that so that we can make this a complete soil fertility map of Kenya. In relation to that question and the question of irrigation, I think is really what's behind that. Yeah, clearly there are needs for irrigation in many areas, but our findings of the last 22 years is that we have not by far got anywhere close to the yield potential in our high rainfall areas. And therefore, if we're going to have a management, a national policy around agriculture, we need to balance irrigation development projects with the ability to support farmers in dryland farming areas who are still yielding at less than 50% of the yield potential. So we really have to always balance this discussion between irrigation and dryland farming, and that is very clear in our work with dryland farmers and how we can increase yields with good agronomy.
Okay.
Maybe one comment on the adding moisture, soil moisture as a covariate. I mean, the area of interest was designed mainly highly intensive agricultural areas, and there, by definition, moisture is not the main limiting factor. So when you can melt down or harmonize your area of interest, then actually there's less need of additional covariables to explain more of the variance. Yeah, so there's always the bigger the area, the less is unknown, the more sparse points, real points are distributed, the more covariables are helpful. But the more you zoom in, the more is standardized, the less they contribute positively and are not needed in turn as well. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Thomas. So we have to end the Q&A session there because of time. So right away, I would like to welcome Professor Hamadi Boga, the PS, to give his highlights on the mapping portal. Professor Boga, you're welcome. Boga.
So thank you very much, everyone. Sorry for the hitch at the start. It was due to, I had to reboot the computer. But I think I saw the presentations, both the one from Rwanda and Burundi. as well as the other two presentations about the soil mapping in Kenya. And I know it was done in 21 counties, but I think still this is very, very vital information that is critical both for us here at the policy level, as well as the farmers themselves and the companies that are making fertilizer. I think the challenge will then is for us in the ministry, is to see how this influences us as we develop our soil health policy. Right now, there is a process which has begun some time back. We're just trying to conclude it about developing a soil policy. And I think the data in this portal, the information can that we said we were
Professor Boga? Professor Boga?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we lost you a
Yes,
little
can
bit.
you hear me?
But now we can hear you. Thank you. We can hear you now. Yes, we can hear you now. You can go on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in the past, through programs, of course, and through the initiatives of AGRA to push certified seeds and to push fertilizer across Africa, we introduced the subsidy fertilizer program, but it ended up being a program about the DAP largely. Of course, later we changed policy and started promoting blended fertilizer, but still it was not really informed by updated soil maps and updated soil information. And so I think this portal now with all the information and the maps should guide the government as well as the investors on how to invest in the fertilizer space. The government has, of course, moved away from bulk purchase of fertilizer, which is in the past. Right now, we have embraced e-voucher. And in the e-voucher, basically, a farmer receives a subsidy in the form of a 40% voucher, not just for fertilizer, but for a range of inputs. And we have been working with fertilizer companies to make sure that different fertilizer types are available in different agrovets, because the farmers are expected to get their fertilizer from the agrovets. So I think so far so good. What we had wanted to integrate was the issue of soil testing, but we faced a challenge when we were recruiting the soil testing company. I didn't realize it was such a contested space. So we haven't concluded that process, but the pricing is what will determine the way forward, because the pricing must be affordable for soil testing to the smallholder farmer. Most of the quotations were way too expensive, and I think we need to revisit the issue of soil testing, because it's key for the farmer to buy the blend that is specific to their challenge in their farm. Apart from the county-wide maps, I think we expect individual farms also to do their own soil testing so that they can get the right blends. The ministry is working very hard to set up the Kenya Agriculture Information Management System, and I think this soil map portal would be an important cog there, because if we are able to link it to KIAMIS, then the information will be available to farmers, to policymakers, and to the other stakeholders. So I welcome Jeremy and team to also collaborate with our efforts to have an integrated information management system for the agriculture sector, which includes information on soils and other parameters that are key to agriculture. I think the other thing that we are really appreciative of the efforts of IFCD. They've been a good partner, not just in this, but other programs. And we really appreciate the engagement and the knowledge that is generated through their efforts. I have had a comment about the ASAL areas. I think from the work of Stuart, Baden, and the Adventure Group, we can see that even the ASAL have potential. And they have good soil, some of them good black cotton soil or even loam soil. And I think the limiting factor there is water. And I think through the practice of conservation agriculture, we can still turn those into production areas. So I think we can work together to identify some of these areas where we get at least 300 millimeters of rain and where we can still grow crops. And I think do the mapping in those areas to support expansion. And I think that is where most of the land is left, because since yesterday we've been talking about land. A lot of the land in the high rainfall areas has been subdivided to the point that it is no longer economically viable to do certain enterprises. And so the opportunity for large-scale farms, which we seek as a government, is in the ASAL areas. So I think as we can work together to explore other funding opportunities to expand the soil mapping. Otherwise, I would really appreciate the engagement and the lessons from this exercise, and share the link so that we can visit. And probably you need to guide us on how we can use the portal at the policy level, but also how the farmers can use the portal. And I wonder whether there will be a possibility to have an app or something so that it can also be, the information can be accessed. Remember, with the World Bank, with the World Bank program of Kenya Climate Smart Agriculture Project, we have a big data platform at KALRO, and it has agro-weather information. I think it would be smart also to include this soil information. That probably would require a conversation between CropNuts and KALRO and the World Bank to see how to integrate that information. Otherwise, thank you very much, and let's continue with the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Boga. We really appreciate for your time and availing yourself for this, even for the previous webinar that you were able to attend in the preliminary webinar. Thank you for the great support too. And we are hoping that the mapping portal is going to be important in the Kenyan strategy. So now we apologize, we may run a little bit 5 minutes into the time, but I would really like to invite Dr. David Kamau, who is the head of Environment and Natural Resources Management at the Kenya Agricultural and Research and Livestock Research Organization, to give some key webinar highlights and closing remarks. Thank you. Dr. David Kamau, you're welcome.
Thank you, Mercy. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I want to start by thanking maybe all of us who are in attendance. And just before I give the concluding remarks,
Dr. Kamau, we seem to be losing you.
just before I give the concluding remarks, I want to
Dr. Kamau, can you hear me? We seem to be losing you.
Professor.
We
Hello,
seem to
you can hear me now?
Yes, that's much better
Can
now.
you hear me now?
Yes, you can go ahead.
It's much better.
Yes.
Yes, it's where I'm connected from. Maybe that's where the challenge is. But oh, no, I'm connecting with my phone, and maybe
Yes,
that's where the challenge is. Now
no,
let me start with what you can. Okay. I think the highlights. The first thing is to really appreciate what the PS, the Principal Secretary, has said, that the information that will be generated by this soil map portal will be so vital for guiding policy and also for farmers and other stakeholders. I think that is key. Then the PS has also indicated that the ministry is in the process of developing this soil health policy, which I think would be of great interest to maybe this grouping. Also, he also did indicate that the ministry had at one time this big fertilizer subsidy program that was probably not very well science based, so that it ended up promoting just the NPKs and the NPs, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus fertilizer. And the program did not do so well. But I think with this initiative, which now will start with the smart process, which starts with the soil sampling, all the way to mapping recommendations and the transfer, will certainly be the best approach to maybe use. And finally, I think he did say that he did request that if we can have an app that can be jointly done with Caro and the Kenya Agriculture KCSAP project. I think that would be a good thing, because this app will be available up to the farmer level, and I think that is where we probably need to go. Going further to this presentation that was done, the presentation that was done by Dr. John Wett about the smart approach in delivering balanced fertilizers to farmers. I think this is a good way of doing it, in that if you look at what has been done in the past, there was too much, thinking about the NPKs, and we forgot the other micro and trace elements, which have now been incorporated maybe in this work. And the smart approach, like he said, involves, you start with the soil analysis, you go to mapping, where you identify the nutrient deficiencies, and the most important thing is that all the samples that are collected should be georeferenced, because I think in Kenya we have a serious problem, because we have so many samples that were not georeferenced, that cannot now be traced back to where they were done. So it means that this is a good way of doing it. Then, of course, recommendations development. This is another big area which requires fertilizer formulations to be developed and to be validated in the field. Then, of course, the scaling up, which is about the transfer to farmers, and I think this is important. Then, of course, you lead this to policy and recommendations. Jeremy did give a presentation, and today he focused on all the 21 counties. I think for those who are in the meeting that we had on the 4th of August, he did cover 10 counties. So today he did cover the 21 counties that he has done soil mapping, and like he said, all the 21 counties are the ones that are considered to be high productivity counties, and they have gone as much as getting 3,700 samples, and have gone through the steps that he very well elaborated, from sampling to testing. And the beauty is that he has used, the lab has used wet chemistry methods, which do not need any validation. Then he's gone to geospatial analysis, and at the end of the day, done the so-called nutrient maps. That is why we are probably here. And just to go to a bit of the findings that he did. The first thing is about the methodologies that he used, that were used, and these were very well defined by Thomas, and whereby they have the interpolation and probability maps, where these interpolation maps is just an issue of inputting the soil data based on the soil sampling points, and the probability maps where they consider areas that may have potential deficiency, nutrient deficiency or acidity related problems. And you can see, and I think they did very well show that you can actually be able to see using the maps that they showed based on the sampling points, that you can actually be able to see and read these maps, even for those who are not experts in this area. It's important to also appreciate that they have gone as much as producing 588 maps using the geostatistical approach, and these maps are based on per county and per soil property, where they have captured 14 soil properties. And of course, one of the challenges that really he did say, and he sort of requested that maybe this is something that we can still look at, is the interpolated values, which are based on an area of 25 hectares, which may not be very, very friendly for the smallholder farm sizes that we have. Another key thing that Jeremy presented was what to use these soil maps for, and he did give some areas to understand variations in maybe these particular areas, to identify sites that are good for liming, and sites that will require fertility improvements, supporting the lime subsidy programs, supporting the fertilizer subsidy programs, and areas where you can assess agricultural productivity, and also what not to use these soil maps for. I liked the idea of the maps should not be used as a tool for selling fertilizer to farmers. I think that was a good thing. Then on I think the way forward, and I think this is critical, that we develop a framework for use of. We need to develop a framework for use of these soil maps, and also developing partnership frameworks for updating these soil maps, which are so important, and exploring added value synergies with other platforms that are already in place. We've had a lot of these other platforms. And most importantly is that within a very short time. I think, Jeremy, you talked of maybe 9 months. You have been in this for about 9 months, and you have been able to generate these soil maps in a timely and using minimal resources. And I think that is the way to go. I think, moderator, that would probably be just a snapshot of what has been presented this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamau, for the great remarks and highlights of the webinar. And because of time, we are going to wrap up this. And on behalf of KeFERT, IFDC, our collaborators at the Crop Nuts, I would like to thank each one of you for creating time to be part of this webinar. Special thanks go to the PS, Professor Boga. Thank you so much for your time. And our presenters, Dr. Went, Mr. Cordingly, Mr. Thomas, and Dr. David Kamau, for their great and insightful highlights and presentations. Just as a reminder, recording was being done during the webinar, and this will be available to all of you when ready. It will also be published on the IFDC portal. We'll also try and do follow-up emails to questions that were not answered because of time, and these will be answered to specific participants using the contact emails that were used during the registrations. So again, thank you all and have a good day. Thank you so much.